space you have for sewing pretty small? Or maybe you sew in a space that is shared with other people and also used for other activities. Or perhaps your sewing space is both small and shared. We're spending this week's and next week's episodes finding out how we can make these situations work better for ourselves, so that we can have successful and fulfilling sewing lives no matter the situation. Today we're going to hear from lots of sewers about their small or shared sewing spaces, and lots of useful tips that you can apply to your space today. So hang around but a few minutes and we'll get into it. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 16 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis, and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. And I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello, lovely one. How are you doing this week? This week has been an intense one for me. It was my birthday at the beginning of the week. I'm now 5 years away from joining the Sew Over 50 community. And it was also half-term holidays, so I spent it entertaining my kids. I'd never make a big deal out of my birthday, but if you'd like to give me a little gift, could you please take a minute and go and give Check Your Thread a rating and review in your favourite podcast app? I put that little request out on Instagram on my birthday, and since then one person has stepped up and added a new review on the Apple Podcast app. So big thanks to South Coast Mum, who gave the podcast 5 stars and wrote, "Diverse, interesting and thought-provoking with so many ideas that are easy to adopt, and some that make everything easier and far, far better." Thank you so much for that, South Coast Mum. That was really, really sweet. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And yeah, I definitely think that this week's episode is going to have loads of ideas that are going to make everything far, far better for lots of sewers. So that's really cool. So apparently these reviews do make a big difference to a podcast's discoverability, which is especially helpful if you're a little DIY effort like I am. So I'd be super grateful if you would also take a moment to leave a rating and review. You could even pop the podcast on pause right now and get it done. So thank you. Also, thanks this week to Lynn, Lucia, Diana, Rosie, Lizeth and Esther, who are all awesome people who signed up to support the podcast via Patreon. You are all amazing. Thank you so much. So let's crack on with this week's episode. So this is a community episode and you'll be hearing the thoughts and experiences submitted by Check Your Thread patrons and subscribers to the weekly Check Your Thread newsletter. By the way, if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the newsletter on the homepage of checkyourthread.com. Just scroll to the bottom and pop your email address in. You won't regret it. I love making community episodes because I really want to include different voices, different perspectives and such on this podcast. However, despite the content being from other people this week, you will be hearing quite a bit of my voice. So apologies for that. A lot of the awesome submissions came in the form of written messages. Someday I hope to be able to pay for voice actors or something, but in the meantime, you've got me reading those out. Thanks so much to everyone who submitted their contributions. Each of them has added so much depth and richness to this topic. Next week's episode is more of a summary of what you'll hear today, which is going to be more of a practical guide. I'm super excited about these 2 episodes because I know there'll be heaps of takeaways in both that is really going to help a lot of people improve their sewing situations and how they feel about them. So until next week, take care of yourself, your loved ones and the wider global community. Leave a rating and review of the podcast, please, and enjoy. The sustainability of sewing can be thought of in a personal sense, i.e., how can I best utilise my space, my time and my activities so I can fit more of what I love into my daily life? As you probably know, I love debunking the myth that a successful and fulfilling sewing life requires a huge disposable income, acres of dedicated space and investment in lots of new resources. I decided it's time we explored the middle part of this myth, the acres of dedicated space, more closely. I put a shout out to the amazing patrons of the podcast and to the subscribers of the Check Your Thread newsletter, asking them about their experiences of small and or shared space sewing. I wanted to get a sense of some of the setups that people sew and create in. Partly because I'm nosy, but mainly because I want to normalise the idea that you can have a fun sewing life in which you create wonderful garments in all manner of setups. You don't have to have a separate room purely dedicated to sewing, with brand new design for purpose furniture, ideal lighting, abundant storage and so on to be a successful sewer. If you do have that set up, I'm not ragging on you, I'm super happy for you. I just want the rest of us to feel equally empowered to make what we want in the spaces that we have. So I wanted to see if there's any practical tips for sewing in a small or shared space that we could learn from. Creative people don't limit their creativity to one area, so I knew that the awesome listeners of Check Your Thread would have cooked up some clever solutions to the challenges of their sewing spaces. So to set things up, I asked the patrons and subscribers to respond to the following 4 questions. 1. Briefly describe your setup. 2. Is there anything you like about where you sew, because of or despite its orientation and location? 3. What do you dislike or what frustrates you about it? And 4, are there any tips you've learnt or figured out for yourself that makes your small and or shared space work better? Programming note, I didn't have the time to confirm everyone's pronouns when I was putting this together, so everyone's getting neutral pronouns in this episode. If that bugs you, then this isn't the podcast for you. Onwards, first we'll hear from Emma in Australia.
Hi Zoe, it's Emma here calling from the Lockyer Valley in Queensland, Australia. My sewing space is definitely shared. It used to be our dining room, and when COVID hit and working from home started, that became my home office, and it's also where my son's computer desk is. So I have my home office in there, my son's computer, and all of my sewing stuff. I have a bookcase with doors on it, and inside the bookcase has my projector, so I can close the bookcase to hide the projector when it's not in use. And I have a cutting table, which was our old dining table. It was an IKEA table. It's an IKEA table that extends, but I put caster wheels on it, big heavy duty ones, and so I can roll the table up to where the projector is. It has a cutting mat on it, and I also use that table for my machines, my sewing machines. So they fit neatly onto the end of the table when I'm cutting, and then I can move them, space them out a little bit more when I'm actually sewing things together. I like having the cutting table or the sewing desk on wheels, because then I can sort of wheel it towards the wall and it sort of tucks out of the way. And I like having the doors on the bookcase because I can close it and it sort of hides the clutter of the projector, and my sewing bits and bobs are in there as well. Probably one of the frustrations is that I do have to clean it up quite a lot. I have to vacuum a lot because of the scraps on the floor, especially if people are coming over, and put everything away neatly. So I have lots of tubs to store fabric and current projects. My ironing board is set up just all the time anyway, right in front of a window, so I can stare out the window while I press. However, I really like it because I'm in the middle of the house. My kids are around when they're at home. My husband's around, so I'm not tucked away, and I can still interact with the whole family while I sew, and I don't feel like I'm shutting myself away and checking out from the family. So I'm still involved. The kitchen's right there too, so it's very handy for snacks. And that's the way that I sew. Thank you for all you do. I really love your podcast. Keep it coming. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thanks, Emma. Catherine wrote in to talk about their previous sewing setup in their previous home. Catherine lives in the UK. In our first home, we had a room of all things. It was the dining, kitchen area, office, playroom, access to garden, etc., etc., etc. Along one wall was a table where the office computer work was done, with my sewing machine at the end. So joy! Sewing machine set up all the time, but microscopic place to work. All the fabric was in the attic, and only what I was working on would be over by the machine. I would sew a seam whilst waiting for the potatoes to boil or the timer to go off to get something out of the oven. I would cut out on the dining table whilst helping with homework, etc. I had a pin board in front of the machine where the pattern instructions would be pinned, and paper pattern pieces as I finished with them, and inspiration photos and light tools, etc., i.e. a rotary cutter with bias binding tool all on the pin board. So the things I liked, it had lovely light and I felt part of family life. It just fitted in. There were frustrations, however, fabric and things being somewhere else. My tips for other sewers in small and shared spaces. It's amazing how much you can sew in 6 minutes, or press or pin, etc. And after a week, fitting in just 6 minutes here and there, a garment is well on its way to being complete, even with babies, toddlers and now teenagers and a full-time job. Also, using mini IKEA ironing boards for space saving, and working on one project at a time and keeping everything stored together so nothing gets lost. Now I have a whiteboard where I write what the next sewing step is so I don't lose track of what I'm doing. Thanks for the podcast, Zoe. Well, thank you, Catherine. Another contribution that I'm going to read out, this time from previous guest Liz Hayward, the zero waste pattern designer who lives and works in Australia. Go back and listen to Liz in episode 31, but not right now, after this one. So Liz says, regarding small and shared spaces, I feel I have a lot to say on the subject. Not only have I been a dining table sewist my whole life, but I now have a sewing-based business with the same situation. My sewing setup is a small folding sewing table which sits in the corner of our kitchen. There's enough room on it for the sewing machine and a box of tools or threads, the ones I use all the time. I cut out on the kitchen table which has extendable leaves and set the overlocker up on the kitchen table after cutting out. I bring the ironing board from the laundry for pressing. There are some advantages to this setup. The natural light from the window is great. The kitchen is warm in winter and cool in summer. I can sew whilst organising dinner, and when my children were little, I would set them up to play whilst I sewed. I claimed this setup as temporary 12 years ago, but no one has complained, so I've left it. I keep the machine covered with an old tablecloth when it's not in use as it gets dusty in the kitchen. I don't sew every day, I tend to cut and sew in blitzes. There's not a great deal of space, I only keep things I'm currently using in the kitchen setup. I have a cupboard, formerly a cocktail cabinet, in another room for storing patterns, haberdashery, including non-everyday threads, overlocker threads, spare machines, etc. My fabric stash comprises of 8 50-litre plastic tubs of fabric, 2 of which are in my bedroom and the others are in the shed. There's also an archive of zero-waste garment samples, 3 50-litre bins, which are currently in the hallway, but this isn't ideal. Thoughts on small and shared sewing spaces. Try to keep your regular machine set up all the time, as it's much easier to sew when you don't have to set up every time. For other machines like overlocker, cover stitch, etc. that have to be set up especially, try and get a project to the point where all the overlocking is done before you have to pack it away. With a small sewing space, only keep the things you immediately need there. Squirrel other stuff in spaces around the house. Regularly edit your fabric stash and scrap bin. Limit the number of unfinished projects as they'll lie around the house reminding you of their presence. Go on and finish them. And keep your small shared sewing space area tidy if it's a public area of the house. Set some boundaries so it doesn't become a dumping ground for other family members' gear. For works in progress, try and get them to a stage where they can be safely put on a coat hanger and hang them in your wardrobe to store. Thanks for that, Liz. If someone for whom sewing is their main source of income can make it work in the kitchen, then we all can, I reckon. Such thoughtful tips in there. So now we're going to hear from Debs, who is in the UK.
Hello, Zoe. My name's Debs. I'm at Debs Made This on Instagram. And I sew in a corner of our dining room. I have been sewing for about 10 or 11 years, I think, increasingly over that time, and have progressively taken over a little bit more. My setup is therefore there all the time. And the things I really like about it are that it faces over the garden. So I have a beautiful view even when the weather is not so good. I can see the trees and the sky, which is always a good thing. It means the light that comes in to where I'm sewing is also really nice. When the children were smaller, I have 3 children, they would come and do their homework or do crafts at the dining table while I was sewing. So that was always a really nice thing. Now they're teenagers, they're less inclined to do that, unfortunately. But there are spaces for them to sit whilst I'm sewing, or I can leave the sewing and talk to them. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of still is their space as well, which I really like. The only thing I dislike about it is this is a 1930s house and this is the only window that hasn't been refurbished. So we're waiting to put big fancy trifold doors in from about 12 or 13 years ago and it still hasn't happened. So it gets a bit chilly. But I do have good big thick curtains so I can close them. In addition, my husband is very good with a saw and thinking outside the box. And so I have a refurbished high board, which is like a sideboard but taller, that he's put rails on. So my sewing machine and overlocker are on sliding rails. So I sit in a very fancy chair, which again is refurbished. And the machines slide along so that I don't move about too much when I'm sewing. That means that I can sew and finish very quickly. I normally set the ironing board up just behind me, and then I've got that nice triangle of work. He's also done me a spool stand for my overlocker threads and all sorts of other bits and pieces, so he's very helpful. I think my top tips for having a small space or a shared space is having a space for everything. So having a place that things go to so that you can put your hands on things really easily. Obviously, I've taken over quite a lot of the storage in the dining room, but we've just put in a big wardrobe cupboard that I can keep all my patterns in, so they're kind of out of the way. And that's key for me, really, is having somewhere to put things and trying to keep reasonably tidy. The good thing about having a shared space is it does encourage you strongly to tidy up, because if somebody's coming over for lunch, you've got to have a space that looks a bit more reasonable. It also means that people are very used to our space being full of creative mess. I hope that's helpful. Sorry it's so long. Thanks for everything that you do, Zoe, and I'm really sorry about the problem with your fabric stash. Oh, in addition, my fabric is stored mostly not in here. The only things that are immediately likely to be made are stored in the dining room. Everything else is stored in big boxes underneath my bed, which are mostly labelled so that I know where each piece of fabric is.
I think I speak for a lot of us when we say, can your husband build us some sweet custom sewing table solutions, please? Next up is a submission from Serena, who lives in Switzerland. My sewing space is in my bedroom. In one corner, my sewing machine and overlocker sit cheek by jowl on a tiny desk, with accessories in the desk drawer and threads on a pegboard on the wall. At the opposite corner, the ironing board is set up temporarily 98% of the time. Patterns and twill fabric are in my closet, fabric notions and scraps in a cupboard in the living room. It's an efficient setup. I can pop over and sew a seam during lunch break if I'm working from home. And the fact that it's right in my bedroom forces me to tidy up after I'm done sewing. Nobody wants to step on a pin on their way to the bathroom. On the flip side, the artificial lighting is terrible, and in the winter months that means no sewing in the evenings. Sewing in a small and shared space works for me because everything has a place and is out of the way when not in use. I've made pretty matching covers for the machines and the ironing board so the space looks nice, which motivates me to keep it tidy. This is not to say I don't daydream of the day my kids will move out and I can set up a craft room in their bedroom with a long desk under the window and a cutting table. My kids are 12 and 8, so it might be a while. Oh, Serena, I have an ironing board that is temporarily set up at least 98% of the time in our lounge, so I feel you. Let's hear from another contributor, Nikki, who lives in one county over from me.
Hi Zoe, Nikki here from Westdean near Chichester in West Sussex. Just responding to your request for ideas about small sewing spaces or non-permanent sewing spaces. I use my dining room table for several reasons, but mainly the good light in the space and the proximity to an electricity socket. I have other spaces in the house I could sew, but they've either got terrible light or not near a socket or whatever. And I find the answer to having to clear up for each meal is to make sure you've got a plan for where you'll clear up to. So I have a large one of those collapsible crates ready to put all my bits of fabric and odds and ends into, and then I just take the sewing machine off the table and put it underneath the table but leave it plugged in for dinner, and then I'm ready to set everything back up again after the meal is over. Hope that's helpful to folks, and thanks very much for your wonderful podcast, which I love. Bye.
Really good tips there. Thanks, Nikki. As Nikki says, it's not all about the organisation of your resources. Staying organised within the steps of your project can also lead to an easier and more enjoyable sewing life too. Next, we're going to hear from another awesome previous Check the Thread guest, Rachel Kirby, who was on episode 82. That was a great one. Give it a listen if you haven't already. Anyway, Rachel says, My family of 4 live in Australia in a small 2-bedroom cottage. As we have one living room that serves as our kitchen, dining, lounge and study, I find that I mostly set up at the kitchen table to sew. We have a small fold-out table in our bedroom that I occasionally use as well. I enjoy that I'm part of the family and that we are all spending time together in the one room, even if we are each doing our own thing. Both my husband and I work full-time, so I'm glad that even while sewing, I can still be in the room with my family. However, sometimes it feels like it's going to take too much energy to clear the table and set up my machine. But that means I have to spend more time knitting this year. One thing I love about living in a small space is that it forces me to be mindful about my consumption. I cannot just buy and make lots of things, as I would have nowhere to put them. I have to be considered in what I make too. Being more considered has led me to a slower making practice, but one that brings me great joy as I feel I've made high quality, well thought out garments and accessories. As for tips, I utilise our local library and borrow sewing and knitting books. I have a fold-out table in my bedroom to sew at if the kitchen table is unavailable. This doubles as my work from home desk. I store my sewing and knitting supplies with my clothes in my wardrobe. It isn't necessarily Instagram aesthetics, but our cottage is small, busy, creative and full to the brim with family life, and it honestly brings me so much joy. Oh, that sounds lovely, and so in keeping with your whole making philosophy, Rachel. Catherine, who is in the UK, says, I'm lucky enough to have a room that I don't need to pack away when I sew. I made the decision that I wanted a sewing room more than a home office, so now I work on the sofa to preserve the sewing sanctuary. I have 3 little tips for limited space. Bobbin storage, still one of my best purchases, an M&S truffle box, possibly Christmas themed, containing 6 truffle balls with weirdly glittering coatings. Eat the truffles, and each space in the box perfectly fits 2 bobbins, sideways, which allow you to see the thread colour. Collapsible surfaces. I like ironing boards. They fold flat quickly and can go behind doors and cupboards. They're also height adjustable, so can be used either sitting or standing. On a hard floor, I find they are easy to slide around the room, so it's not a problem if they're set up in front of a cupboard door, for example, because you can just pivot it aside to open the door. And the padded surface is useful for pinning things in place, and obviously ironing onto directly. I made a quilt whilst sitting on my sofa with the sewing machine on an ironing board at a low height in front of me, and the iron on the floor ready and keeping my feet warm. I always keep a couple of carrier bags hanging from doorknobs, one for fabric and thread scraps, and the other for paper for recycling. It keeps them out of my way, and I always know where they are. Love these tips, Catherine, and the invitation to look at ironing boards in a new multi-purpose light. Gemma from the UK says, I sew in a fairly small space, our spare room, which also serves as a home office and laundry airing space and the only route to our bathroom, so we can't junk it up. I'm very aware of how lucky I am to have any dedicated space for sewing. I didn't for a long time, but finally set up my table just before the start of lockdown, when the spare room then also accommodated my husband's desk. We managed this by having a sofa bed rather than a guest bed. I have a pine gate leg table from a charity shop. I paid 40 quid for it, and it originally came from John Lewis. It's significantly better quality than anything I would have bought new. That's my sewing table, and I protect it with a cushion table protector. I unfold it and drag the office chair over to it when I want to sew. When it's folded up, it doesn't take up much space and also isn't too tempting as a dumping ground because most of the horizontal space is occupied by my machine. A lot of my other sewing space solutions come from IKEA. A pegboard, mini ironing board that badly needs more padding, but is a great space saver and hangs on the pegboard when not in use. My fabric resource is on 3 shelves of a Billy bookcase, which we already had, mostly contained within boxes to protect it from the light, and Ziploc bags, which I reuse for more fabric provided they're intact, to keep out the dust and moths. And my top tip, a little 3-layer trolley that houses things like my pincushion, scissors and iron. I find it very handy to be able to wheel it into range and out of the way. For me, it isn't really sewing that takes up much space so much as pressing, hence the mini ironing board, and cutting out, for which I commandeer the dining table. I like that I have a dedicated sewing space without major upheaval in the house, and I definitely sew more as a result because I don't have to tidy everything away at mealtimes. I also like that I can look out the window as I sew and that I'm not disturbing my husband if he's watching TV. There are a couple of disadvantages to this setup. One is that it isn't brilliant for ergonomics, so I don't feel comfortable sewing for more than a couple of hours at a time. The other is that I'm sometimes delayed because it's not convenient for me to use the dining table to cut out. I think adaptability is the key in a small space. I don't need all my equipment out all the time, although I try to be efficient by doing all my pressing in batches. I'm also very aware that I do not have space, physical or mental, for a big fabric stash, so this is something for me to keep an eye on as my sewing develops. A thing that I want to do better on is keeping things tidy. I don't always see the clutter, but being tidy makes small spaces easier. I'd also like to see whether I can improve the ergonomics of my space. Thank you, Gemma. So here's Georgina, also from the UK. I'm a kitchen table sewing person and I have a wall of notions to hand. I keep all my haberdashery in wicker baskets in a pile in my bedroom, and my fabric stash is in boxes under the desk in my husband's bedroom. I cover the desk with a curtain so he can't see it. I gather together everything I need for my current project so I don't have to traipse up and down stairs. I like working in the kitchen as I can leave my ironing board set up and cook dinner at the same time. This arrangement probably wouldn't work if I had children still at home. Thank you, Georgina. I love the idea of using wicker baskets to house your haberdashery. I bet that looks lovely. And this is from Bridget. In my last home, I sewed on the dining table and had to pack everything away after each session. I kept all my sewing stuff in shoe boxes, one for the project I was working on with fabric, pattern and all the notions, and one for my regular sewing equipment, scissors, chalk, seam gauge, etc., and others for specific parts of a project like all my cutting out stuff and pattern weights. I'd sort everything out as I needed at the start of each project, and then every time I got a chance to sew, I would just pull the relevant boxes out and get started. I'm lucky enough to have a dedicated spot now, still less than a metre square, but I still try to keep everything sorted into boxes. Shoe boxes are genius. Thank you, Bridget. This contribution is from Caro. My sewing supplies are scattered around the house with themes for each space, so I've got more chance of knowing where my things are. So scraps, new fabric, embroidery, current projects are all in different places. I keep my sewing machine behind my chair at the dining table. I put it away each time so I remember how quick it is to set up so I'm not put off by sewing when I haven't got much time. I like being in the same room as my cat and partner, so maybe a separate room wouldn't be so good, although it would be nice to be able to leave things spread out for the ideas stage of a project. I've also been using the Stash Hub app to keep track of things. It's like having my own shop. I really like how it's arranged and all the work they do to keep updating it. Your approach to organising is very interesting, Caro. Things are spread around your house, but they're all nice and visible in the Stash Hub app. That works really well. And lastly, as a small and shared space sewer myself, I'm going to chime in as well. So my sewing space is a small vintage 1950s Formica-topped kitchen table that lives in one corner of our main downstairs room, which is also our lounge, dining room, my husband's office, kids' playroom, library and so on. The table is next to the dining area and my sewing machine and overlocker plus a little set of wooden IKEA drawers for notions are permanently on top. The table isn't big enough for the machines to be side by side, so I swap them over by pulling one in front of the other, depending on what stage of the project I'm at. Above the table are some built-in shelves. On the lower one, I have all my printed out PDF patterns in lever arch files. On the other wall behind, I have a larder cupboard that's the kind of size of a small wardrobe that houses patterns in envelopes and notions. Plus I have a 1960s wooden sewing box that's kind of the size of a small coffee table. That's got notions in it as well, including elastic. Plus I have a stack of plastic tubs in the corner, which has fabric scraps and current projects in. Plus, there's a small bookcase close by that houses some of my sewing books, plus yet more of my notions. When I'm mid-project flow, I'm not very tidy, and there's pattern pieces and such all over the place. But I always have a good tidy up about once every 2 weeks. But like many people, I love that I can sew whilst being part of family life. I can get a bit done here and there whilst also keeping an eye on the kids. And sometimes in the evenings, when we don't want to watch TV, my husband might be working on his own projects on his computer in the other end of the room, and I can sew and we can listen to music together and occasionally chat. I also like that my sewing table and chair is next to a radiator because I get cold easily, and it's next to a window so I get natural light in the daytime, and I can catch glimpses of my little garden. And I like that my sewing space is right next to the dining table because I then use that for pattern prep and cutting out pattern pieces and pinning. The main thing I dislike about my sewing area is the lighting after dark, and that's something I really need to figure out. My tips would be, if you're naturally a messy creative like me, make sure you force yourself to tidy up at semi-regular intervals. At the end of a project perhaps, to stop things getting out of hand. And even if you're not able to be super organised, try keeping items like with like. So zips with zips, elastics with elastics, like pattern cutting tools all together, and so on. It will save you loads of time when tidying and less time searching for the right item. Okay, so there we go. Enormous thanks to the patrons and subscribers who shared their experiences of small and shared space sewing. So in next week's episode, part 2 of this one, I'm going to collate the tips that were shared in today's episode with some more thrown in that I've picked up along the way. So that one will be more of a direct guide. But I'm hoping that you enjoyed hearing from all these unique situations and experiences. Maybe you found yourself relating to some of them. Maybe you already feel you've got some takeaways that you can apply to your own situation. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!